You keep telling yourself it's confusing, but what if it's not confusion at all? What if it's just consistency showing up in a language you were never taught to read? They didn't text you back. They pulled away just when things were finally going well. They looked you in the eye and said, "I don't need anyone." And now you're left wondering if they even feel anything at all. But here's what nobody really explains. That distance, that silence, that sudden emotional shutdown right when things get close, it might actually be the closest version of love you're going to get from them. Not because love is meant to hurt, but because their nervous system is built in a completely different way from yours. Stick with this, because once you understand it, you won't be able to unsee it. Drop the word wired in the comments if this is landing for you. It tells me you're here, and it tells me you need to hear more of this. Let's start with something uncomfortable but honest. People who love someone avoidant often spend months or even years in a loop of waiting. Waiting for the reply, waiting for the "I miss you," waiting for consistency, waiting to finally feel chosen. And while they wait, they start questioning everything about themselves. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe they don't care. Maybe I'm imagining the whole thing. But most of the time, you weren't imagining it. You were just trying to read a language you were never taught. Because avoidants don't express love the way you expect. It's not loud. It's not constant reassurance. It's not emotional overflow or endless communication. Their version of care follows a completely different pattern. And if you don't understand that pattern, you'll miss it even when it's right in front of you. That's what this is really about. Learning how to read it clearly. Not to excuse harmful behavior, and not to convince yourself that scraps are enough, but to finally see reality without distortion. Because clarity gives you power, and without it, you stay stuck in confusion. To understand the behavior, you have to understand where it comes from. An avoidant attachment style doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built slowly, over time, usually in early life. Imagine a child reaching for comfort and being met with rejection, emotional distance, or inconsistency. Maybe they're told to stop crying. Maybe their needs are ignored. Maybe love feels conditional, only given when they behave a certain way. Over time, that child's brain learns a simple rule. Needing people isn't safe. Depending on others leads to disappointment. So the safest option becomes not needing anyone at all. That's where the "I don't need anyone" identity comes from. It's not just a personality trait, it's protection, it's survival, it's emotional armor built over years of unmet needs. Now fast forward to adulthood. That same person enters relationships still wearing that armor. Not because they don't feel anything, but because feeling deeply, depending on someone, opening up fully, that all triggers danger in their system. So when things start to get emotionally close, their nervous system reacts like it's under threat. It signals them to pull back, shut down, disconnect. Not as punishment to you, but as self-protection. So what does love actually look like from someone avoidant? It doesn't always look like what you expect. It's not constant affection or emotional openness. It can be quiet, subtle, even easy to miss. First, they show up in moments that truly matter. Not every day, not for every small emotional need, but when things become serious. If there's a real crisis, they appear fast. If something goes wrong, they step in and handle it. That's because crisis gives them structure. There's a problem, a solution, an endpoint. Emotional, everyday closeness doesn't have that structure, and that's where they struggle. Second, they stay. This is often overlooked. Yes, avoidants pull away when they feel overwhelmed. Yes, they need space. But if they are still there, still choosing to remain in the relationship despite their instinct to withdraw, that means something significant. Because internally, they are constantly fighting the urge to escape. Staying isn't effortless for them. It takes real internal resistance. And third, they let you into parts of their world most people never see. Avoidants are private by nature, not necessarily secretive, but guarded. Their routines, their habits, their personal space, those things are usually protected. So when they let you see those patterns, when you become part of their private rhythm, that is also a form of trust, even if it doesn't look emotional on the surface. When you zoom out from everything being described here, the core idea is actually simple, even if the emotional experience is not. It's about how people interpret consistency, love, and emotional safety through completely different internal systems, and how that mismatch can quietly shape a relationship into something confusing, intense, and hard to leave even when it doesn't feel stable. Let's start with what consistency actually means in this context. For many people, consistency is defined by frequency and closeness, daily communication, predictable emotional availability, regular reassurance, a steady sense that the person is there, not just physically, but emotionally accessible in a continuous way. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, consistency often looks different. It is not about constant presence, it is about return. They may pull back when overwhelmed, go quiet when emotions feel too intense, or need distance to regulate themselves. Then, after that distance, they come back. They re-engage, they check in, they act like the connection still exists, even after space. And from their perspective, that is consistency. The relationship did not end, it was paused and resumed. From the other person's perspective, though, that same behavior can feel unstable, because what is being measured is closeness over time, not reconnection after distance. So you end up with two people in the same relationship, both interpreting the same behavior through different emotional frameworks. One sees return as stability, the other sees absence as disruption. This is where confusion begins to build, because when you don't recognize that mismatch, you start trying to explain the inconsistency in personal terms. You might think, if they cared, they would stay consistent in the way I understand consistency. And when they don't, it can feel like rejection, uncertainty, or emotional ambiguity. But what is actually happening is a difference in emotional wiring, not necessarily a lack of care. However, and this is where emotional clarity becomes important, understanding this does not automatically mean the behavior is healthy or acceptable in every situation. There is a critical distinction between someone who struggles with emotional closeness but still engages in growth, reflection, and accountability, and someone who uses distance as a way to avoid responsibility, clarity, or emotional effort altogether. Both can look similar from the outside. Both may involve pulling away, returning, being inconsistent, or struggling with emotional expression. But the internal direction is different. One is trying, even imperfectly, to stay connected while managing fear. The other is avoiding connection in a way that prevents growth or mutual understanding. And over time, those differences matter more than the surface-level behavior. This is why the idea of avoidant love cannot be simplified into distance equals love. Distance alone does not prove care. Return alone does not guarantee effort. And moments of warmth do not define the entire relationship. What actually matters is pattern over time. This is where people often get emotionally misled. A single emotional moment can feel very powerful. A deep conversation, a vulnerable night, a moment of closeness, or even an apology can feel like everything is changing. It creates hope. It creates meaning. It creates the feeling that things are finally shifting. But real relational stability is not built on isolated emotional peaks. It is built on repetition. What happens after the emotional moment? Does the behavior change? Does closeness become more sustainable? Does communication become more reliable over time? Or does the same cycle repeat again? Because patterns don't lie in the same way moments do. A moment can feel meaningful even if it never repeats. A pattern reveals reality even when individual moments feel confusing. That is why people get stuck. They are responding to emotional highlights instead of observing the full emotional structure of the relationship. And when you step back far enough, another deeper truth becomes visible. People often confuse potential with reality. Potential is who someone seems to be when they are calm, open, emotionally available, or in a good moment of connection. Reality is who they are across time, during stress, distance, conflict, and emotional discomfort. It is very easy to build a mental picture of a relationship based on someone's best moments. It is much harder to evaluate whether those moments are sustainable or repeatable. But long-term emotional security does not come from potential. It comes from consistency under pressure. This is why the distinction matters, because without it, people often stay emotionally invested in who someone could be rather than who they consistently are. And that leads to one of the most important realizations in all of this. Love alone is not enough if the relational system does not support it. This does not mean love is fake or meaningless. It means love is not the only factor that determines whether a relationship is stable, safe, or sustainable. Two people can genuinely care about each other and still struggle to build a relationship that meets both of their emotional needs. One person may need consistency and reassurance. The other may need space and emotional distance to regulate. Both needs are real, but if they are not aligned or balanced through mutual effort, tension naturally develops. That tension does not automatically mean either person is wrong. It often means the dynamic itself is not working in a sustainable way. And this is where clarity becomes emotionally powerful, but also emotionally difficult. Because clarity forces you to stop romanticizing confusion. Confusion often keeps people emotionally attached because it leaves room for interpretation. If something is inconsistent, it can still be interpreted as meaningful. If someone pulls away and returns, it can still be interpreted as depth. If communication is irregular, it can still be interpreted as complexity rather than instability. But once you begin to see patterns clearly, interpretation becomes less important than reality. You stop asking, "What does this mean?" and start asking, "What is actually happening repeatedly?" That shift is uncomfortable, but it is also freeing, because clarity removes emotional guessing. It removes the hope loops built on occasional connection. It removes the tendency to overvalue rare moments of closeness while ignoring consistent emotional distance. And once that happens, something important changes internally. You begin to see options again. You are no longer trapped inside emotional uncertainty. You are no longer waiting for inconsistency to turn into stability. You are no longer trying to resolve confusion through more patience or more understanding. Instead, you are able to evaluate the relationship based on reality rather than emotional fluctuations. And that brings everything to a final, grounding question. Not whether avoidant love is real, because it can be real in its own way. People can care deeply, even if they struggle to express it consistently. The real question is whether that form of love is real enough for what you need. Because if what you need is consistency, emotional availability, and steady connection, then occasional return and intermittent closeness may not be enough to build emotional safety. And no amount of insight into attachment styles changes that mismatch. Understanding someone's emotional pattern can create compassion. It can create patience. It can create empathy. But it does not require you to stay in a dynamic that continuously costs you your own emotional stability. That is where responsibility enters. Not responsibility to fix them, not responsibility to interpret them endlessly, but responsibility to be honest with yourself about what you can actually live with without losing your own sense of balance. Because at the end of the day, clarity is not just about understanding them, it is about understanding you, your needs, your limits, and what kind of emotional reality you are willing and able to build a life inside. When your entire emotional world starts revolving around one person, something subtle but powerful starts to happen inside you. That person becomes your reference point for almost everything. Your mood, your focus, your sense of stability, even your sense of worth starts shifting depending on how close or distant they feel that day. And without realizing it, the relationship stops feeling like a shared connection and starts feeling like something you're trying to manage emotionally just to stay okay. This is where things begin to get heavy, because closeness in a healthy system is supposed to feel grounding. It's supposed to feel like safety, like expansion, like mutual presence. But when the dynamic is unstable, closeness can start to feel different. It stops feeling like we are together and starts feeling like I need to hold on to this before it disappears. And in that space, something important shifts. The more one person reaches for reassurance, consistency, or emotional contact, the more the other person, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, can begin to pull back. Not because the reaching is wrong, not because love is manipulation, but because for someone who is uncomfortable with emotional intensity or dependency, too much closeness too quickly can feel like pressure on their nervous system. And when that pressure builds, their natural response is to create distance so they can regulate again. So you end up with a cycle that looks like this. One person moves closer to feel secure, the other moves back to feel safe, and both people unintentionally trigger each other's deepest attachment responses. But here is the part most people miss. Understanding this cycle is not about excusing pain or normalizing inconsistency. It is about stepping out of emotional confusion so you can actually see what is happening instead of only reacting to it. That brings us to something crucial. You have to know your limits. Not the limits you think you can stretch because you care deeply. Not the limits you are willing to override because leaving feels too painful or too uncertain. Not the limits you justify because of time invested or emotional history, but your real limits, the ones that are grounded in self-respect, emotional stability, and long-term well-being. The kind of limits that do not require you to disappear inside yourself just to keep the connection alive. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings in relationships involving avoidant patterns is the belief that if you are patient enough, understanding enough, or emotionally flexible enough, things will eventually stabilize. And yes, growth is possible. Avoidant attachment is not fixed. People can change. People can learn. People can slowly develop more emotional capacity over time. But that growth is not fast. It does not happen through one breakthrough conversation. It does not happen because someone finally understands love correctly. It happens through small, repeated shifts over time. A moment where they stay in a difficult conversation instead of shutting down. An apology they manage to say instead of avoiding responsibility. A pause where they notice their urge to withdraw, and instead of disappearing, they come back. These moments matter. They are real indicators of change. But here is the truth that protects you from false hope. They cannot do that because you need them to. A person does not become emotionally available because someone else is waiting for them to become that way. They do not heal their attachment wounds because another person is patiently enduring the consequences of those wounds. Change only happens when they themselves reach a point where staying the same feels more costly than growing. That decision is internal. It cannot be outsourced to your effort, your love, or your emotional endurance. This is where your role becomes very important, but also very misunderstood. Your role is not to fix them. Your role is not to prove your worth through patience. Your role is not to shrink your needs so the relationship becomes easier for them to manage. Your role is clarity. You show up honestly. You communicate what you need without minimizing it. You stay consistent in your own emotional behavior. You model what safety, respect, and emotional responsibility look like. And then you observe. Not in a controlling way, but in a reality-based way. Because over time, the difference between someone who is genuinely growing and someone who is just maintaining a cycle becomes visible. It shows up in consistency. It shows up in accountability. It shows up in whether apologies turn into changed behavior or just temporary relief. It shows up in whether distance decreases over time or keeps repeating in the same pattern. And most importantly, it shows up in how your body feels inside the relationship. Because your nervous system often understands the truth before your mind is ready to accept it. There is also a point in relationships like this where honesty becomes necessary, not as pressure, not as an ultimatum, but as clarity. This is what I feel. This is what I need. This is what I can live with. This is what I cannot. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of direct emotional clarity can feel intense. It can feel like confrontation. It can trigger withdrawal. But someone who genuinely cares does not disappear from honesty. They may need space to process it, but they return to it. They engage with it. They try to understand it. And if they do not, that response is also information. Not as punishment, but as clarity about the nature of the connection. Because clarity, even when it hurts, is always healthier than confusion. Confusion is what keeps people stuck in emotional loops, where they overanalyze silence, overvalue rare moments of closeness, and constantly wait for things to stabilize without any evidence that stability is actually forming. Clarity breaks that loop. And that brings us to a difficult but important realization. Understanding someone's emotional pattern does not mean you are required to live inside it. Having compassion for someone's attachment style does not mean you have to abandon your own emotional needs. You can understand exactly why someone pulls away, shuts down, or struggles with intimacy, and still decide that the relationship is not giving you the consistency or emotional security you need to thrive. That is not judgment. That is awareness. Because a healthy relationship cannot exist if only one person is consistently adapting while the other remains unchanged. Real connection requires mutual movement. Not perfect symmetry, not identical emotional processing, but some degree of growth and effort on both sides. And if you are the only one adjusting, the only one regulating, the only one waiting, the only one trying to understand, then the issue is no longer about attachment styles. It is about imbalance. So when you step back and look at the full picture, you stop evaluating isolated moments. You stop focusing only on the intense closeness that feels meaningful. You stop focusing only on the painful distance that feels confusing. Instead, you begin to see the pattern as a whole. The closeness followed by withdrawal, the connection followed by silence, the warmth followed by uncertainty, the return followed by repetition. And once you see the pattern clearly, something important happens. You are no longer guessing what is real. You are no longer filling in gaps with hope or fear. You are no longer trying to decode mixed signals as if they contain hidden certainty. You are making a decision based on what is consistently happening, not what occasionally appears. And that is where emotional clarity becomes powerful. Because clarity does not always tell you what you want to hear, but it always tells you where you actually stand. And from there, you are no longer stuck in interpretation. You are in choice. At the end of all of this, everything comes down to something much simpler than decoding behavior or analyzing attachment styles. It comes down to truth. Not the truth you hope for in the best moments, and not the truth you fear in the worst moments, but the truth that shows up consistently over time. Because relationships are not built on explanations. They are built on patterns. They are built on what someone repeatedly does when things are good, when things are difficult, and when emotional closeness increases. And once you see that clearly, something inside you shifts. You stop trying to turn inconsistency into meaning. You stop convincing yourself that distance is just a phase that will eventually resolve itself. You stop rewriting silence into depth and confusion into complexity. You start seeing things as they are, not as you wish they could be. And in that clarity, there is both grief and freedom. Grief for the version of the relationship you hoped for. Freedom from the version that was keeping you stuck. Because understanding someone's emotional pattern was never meant to trap you inside it. It was meant to help you see whether the connection is actually capable of giving you what you need. And if it is, you will see growth. You will see effort. You will see movement in the same direction over time, even if imperfect and slow. But if it is not, no amount of patience, empathy, or waiting will turn it into something stable. That is the part many people struggle to accept. Not because they don't understand it, but because letting go of potential is harder than holding on to reality. So the final question is not whether they care in their own way. It is whether that way of loving creates something you can live inside without losing yourself. Because real love is not just about feeling something deeply. It is about building something that can hold that feeling without breaking you in the process. And once you can see that clearly, you are no longer waiting for clarity from them. You become the source of it for yourself.